We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Democrat Representatives Ted Lieu and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez have called for action against the illegitimacy of the Supreme Court, stating that at least 2 Trump-nominated justices lied about their positions on Roe v. Wade during their confirmation hearings. A serious charge or just more partisan nonsense? Well, to figure that out, we're joined by Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor and constitutional attorney to boot, Mr. Scott DeCosenza. Welcome back, Scott.
Thanks, Mark. Pleasure to be here.
So, Scott, let's start with the basics on this. What are Representatives Lieu and Ocasio-Cortez alleging?
Well, they don't so much as allege as they state. We look at the letter they jointly signed. They say that at least 2 justices directly lied to senators. That's a quote from the letter. So it's an allegation of perjury before the Senate Judiciary Committee, to be sure.
So they asked Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer to acknowledge that the justices lied, and then presumably that would be then to take action of impeachment after Senator Schumer says that they lied. Now, what's the process here in terms of rules and regulations? And will Schumer's condemnation really be worth anything?
Well, this is the proper form. As we know, how the Constitution instructs members of the House of Representatives is to address the Senate Majority Leader with letters sent via the post to get his opinion on something and ask for a ruling, and then they can act. Oh, wait.
That's an extra 6.5 cents, by the way. on their postage there, Scott.
That's not how the Constitution says to do things.
Right,
it's
okay.
just a made-up political process by Ms. Ocasio-Cortez and Mr. Lieu. They're members of Congress, Mark. I write letters to congresspersons when I want them to do something. They're members of Congress. The proper form is for them to introduce articles of impeachment into the House of Representatives, if that's what they think is the appropriate action. It boggles the mind, except to say that it seems like the only, and I've racked my brain for an answer that doesn't have to do with electoral politics or fundraising, which are seemingly the only answers that I can gather as to why those 2 members of Congress have chosen to ask a member of the Senate for some opinion statement. It's baffling unless we think of it as political theater, in which case perhaps it makes sense. Although it only makes sense for people who don't understand, I think, have an in-depth understanding of our political process, because then they would come to the same question, which is why are these members of Congress putting it on Chuck Schumer, a member of the U.S. Senate, to do something about it?
Well, yeah, I think a knowledge of how the Constitution works is not something with which Representatives Ocasio-Cortez and Ted Lieu have ever been accused, either fairly or unfairly. So let's get to the brass tacks.
Let me just stop you right there and just say that there are only a few things that the House of Representatives can do that the Senate doesn't. So many times, or perhaps even mostly, our legislation occurs in either one of those houses of Congress, and then there's a reconciliation committee or joint committee to resolve differences in the way a bill maybe have passed the Senate versus the House, and then that compromise reconciliation bill is sent through to make sure that both houses agree on the same language. But that's not true. We don't have that with spending bills and bills of impeachment, which must originate in the House. So it's so funny that the Constitution curves out the House for some very specific things. It's the people's house. It's closest to the people, and they have to do certain things themselves without the Senate. And one of them is impeaching. Yet somehow in that very specific thing, they don't want to take on the responsibility, but shift it to Leader Schumer.
Well, as you say, Scott, it certainly does smack of political theater. But really, is this just some kind of pretense to get public support for packing the court with justices that are perhaps more to the liking of Representatives Lieu and Ocasio-Cortez?
It's tough to say, Mark. I think that both of those congresspersons have demonstrated their support for adding justices to the court, for packing the court, but also when you think of the fundraising benefits that they get from these sorts of things, being able to go back and say, I'm your champion, or for AOC to kind of, maybe succeed in her district. All both these congresspersons are running for reelection in November. So there's electoral politics, not just party politics writ large, but literally the mechanics of how does AOC get back into Congress, right? So there's that to figure out too. So The answer to your question is I don't know. There could be many justifications in their minds for doing so, but we don't know. One thing is for sure, though, it's not the regular order for how to impeach somebody that they believe has lied before the Congress.
Well, actually, I want to dig into that a little bit. So let's say they actually had read the Constitution and understood the rule book for the roles for which they're being very well fiscally rewarded, which of course they haven't. But let's assume that they had for a moment, and they brought up some articles of impeachment within the House. What would happen then? What's the process?
Well, we saw. Donald Trump was impeached twice by the House of Representatives. There's a bill of impeachment, just like other legislation that goes forward. They can hold hearings and take a vote, and then if they vote to impeach, they send that bill of impeachment over to the Senate, where there would be a trial for removal. It's the same process as for President of the United States as it would be for an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, and that's how you toss them out.
Great. So it's exactly the same as how it works with the president.
Yes.
But what I want to know here is, so it's a straight majority in the House. In the Senate, straight majority or 60?
2/3 vote of the Senate's required, Mark.
Okay, so realistically, this has absolutely no chance of getting through because let's be fair, let's look at the ramifications of what would happen if the two congresspersons went
I think
ahead.
that the form, Mark, dictates what you're saying. We know that it doesn't have a chance to get through because if it was, they would be rushing to file that bill of impeachment in the House themselves instead of rushing to send Leader Schumer a letter and then posting
through
it
the post.
That's if they even
the
sent it at all, by the way. They may just have posted it to Twitter. We're not sure if it was actually mailed.
Well, I mean, Twitter is obviously more important than real life. So I think it's really important to address the validity of the representative's argument. Because now I read that letter and you read that letter and they quoted the justices directly, Justices Kavanaugh and Gorsuch.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not a legal scholar, Scott, as you well know. I am not a legal scholar.
Yeah.
But it seems to me, from a plain reading of the actual text that they quoted to condemn the two justices, it didn't seem like they said anything wrong. This is kind of the answers that I would expect somebody to answer.
I think that your mistake there is to think of these things legally rather than politically. So if we think of them legally under what we consider notions of perjury or lying to a court, clearly that's not the case. But if we think of politically, then yes, because that helps AOC and the Democrats. And so that's, if you just reframe your thinking about it and what words mean, then you'll come to a conclusion that meshes with the AOC and squad. I thought
which communist dictator was it who said it doesn't matter if it's correct, it's whether it's politically correct that matters.
Yeah, when they started calling out these charges of perjury for Kavanaugh, I think is the first I heard about it, and then Gorsuch, I actually went back and listened to their confirmation hearings, and I couldn't find anything that they sort of could hang their hat on for any kind of perjury. And I just thought I was missing whatever statements they were. So I'm so glad within the letter. You have to think, if you're going to publish this letter to the public and send it to Leader Schumer, these are the most egregious examples, right? In other words, there are two quotes listed, one for each of the justices for how they quote unquote perjured themselves, but yet no perjury seems present. They're talking about the precedent of Roe v. Wade and that they agree that those are precedents, just like any other precedent of the court. They never promised to not overturn Roe v. Wade, and they never promised that they would vote in any manner. So you're right to say that it doesn't seem like there's perjury here, Mark. That's just because there's not. There's absolutely no statement of fact that is untrue. And that's the hallmark of a civil libel or defamation suit. The hallmark of a bad one is they never actually mention the specific lie or misstatement that was, they just throw out a lot of flowery language about this is outrageous and it's not okay. And, you read the complaint and you think, well, what's the actual false statement alleged? And often it's not there because people just want to make a lot of noise. And these statements that AOC and Mr. Liu have identified as perjurious just seem not to be on any plain reading of the facts.
It's the drumbeat of Capitol Hill. Scott DeCosenza, thank you ever so much.
Thanks, Mark.
And that's almost it for this edition of Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'd like to thank our guests, Lisa K. Donna, Graham J. Noble, Scott DeCosenza, and of course, you, the listener, for being here. My parting shot this week, Bertrand Russell. He once wrote that in all affairs, it's a healthy thing now and then to hang a question mark on the things that you have long taken for granted. Now, this could very well be the calling card of the modern left, who seek every opportunity to change the structure of society, the ways we interact, and the language that we're permitted to use. But Russell was a smart thinker. He meant it for deeper questions also, more so than just mere administration of life. He did not suggest that we should abandon our beliefs, but rather that we should examine them. And this is important. If we don't examine our rationale, our arguments, our beliefs, then we become stagnant in our application of principles and values. Be refreshed, be renewed in your beliefs, and you'll be all the more formidable for it. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
We're doing it for real, really real. Liberty Nation.
And Jeff Charles, contributor for LibertyNation.com.
I think we're starting to make an impact. Liberty style, fight for freedom.
Maybe tracking polls sponsored by Liberty Nation for Thursday.
Mentioned by Dan Bongino, Rasmussen, Jordan Peterson, and
I
others.
can do it again if you want me to.
Cited in Mark Levin's American Marxism.
I think we're starting to make a really big impact. Get noticed. We're doing it. Rock on. I'm gone.